Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation podcast network.
It is important for us to have multiple therapies, even within those classes, to make sure that patients have choice and physicians, pharmacists, nurses have choices to make that can then appropriately treat the patient.
Welcome back to Healthcare Matters, the podcast that pulls back the curtain to help you make sense of complex healthcare economics and policy issues. He's Dr. Robert Popovian, joining us from Washington, D.C., a pharmacist, economist, and Chief Science Policy Officer at the Global Healthy Living Foundation.
And across the country, in Seattle, Washington, he's Connor Mertens, patient advocate and community outreach manager at the Global Healthy Living Foundation.
And listen, we covered a lot of ground in our first season, and we're glad you're here for the start of the second season.
But before we get started, we want to make sure you take a listen to all of the brilliant podcasts on the Global Healthy Living Foundation podcast network.
Right, like The Health Advocates with Stephen Newmark and Zoe Rothblatt, our good friends, where they break down major health news of the week and try to help you make sense of it.
And Connor, you and Zoe co-host Breaking Down Biosimilars, which I was actually one of the guest speakers on it, a podcast that helps us understand the role of biosimilars play in our healthcare system now and in the future.
And you can find all of these at ghlf.org/listen. All right, let's take a look at some of the comments from our listeners. Elisa C. from Twitter says, "This was a great podcast. I listened to it 3 times. Thanks for your review. We invite you too to go to Apple Podcasts and write a positive review and leave an honest 5-star rating. And wherever you're listening, whether it's Apple, Spotify, or the rest, click that subscribe button so you never miss an episode."
Excellent. Before we get into this episode, Connor, we should mention that this is a follow-up to our past episode that we talked about vaccines and the COVID infection. And we're going to have a little bit of a different discussion today. So let's get started on this.
Well, we've talked a lot about the vaccines, and everyone here agrees that everyone should be on top of those vaccines, and it's one of the best ways to end this pandemic. But today we're going to be discussing the treatments that are available for COVID. And one of the things that has brought the death rate down of this disease compared to the beginning of the pandemic has been our ability to continually find new and effective therapies to treat COVID once a patient has got it. And the ability to wean out those treatments that don't work. So Robert, big picture, what do we know about the current available COVID treatments?
Before we even get into the treatments, Connor, it's important for us to realize that we've learned some stuff from this pandemic, right? So first, we've learned that it's far better to do prevention than treatment. We want to have everybody vaccinated, but in some cases, people are just not going to get vaccinated. Not everybody's going to be able to get the vaccine for a variety of medical reasons, whether it's medical concerns, religious exemption, or simply needle phobia. So we do need treatments because we know despite everybody getting the vaccine or most people getting the vaccine, we have breakthrough disease that we need treatments for. So what do we know? Well, currently there are some treatments that have been authorized by the Food and Drug Administration, and it is important for us to educate our patients through Global Healthy Living Foundation of what they are, but most importantly, to have a discussion with their clinicians, their physicians, their pharmacists about what their options may be.
Robert, can you tell us a little bit about how these treatments work? Obviously, I'm sure there's some differences and whatnot, but is there a general mode of treatment that has been most effective?
Not most effective, I would say, Connor, but I would say there are 2 types of therapies that are available in the market currently. One are the antibodies that are injected into the patient, and they can be provided in a pharmacy or through a physician's office. And then there are 2 antivirals that have been authorized by the FDA for the treatment of COVID infection. And all of those therapies are authorized. None of them are fully approved by the FDA, but they are treatments that are available for patients. Again, we should always fall back and make sure that we're vaccinated and fully vaccinated. But there are going to be cases that we cannot be vaccinated or that there's breakthrough disease, so we should have options for those patients.
One of these questions that I have is, will these treatments stay effective, even as the virus itself changes? This Omicron variant looks a lot different than the Delta one did.
Connor, that's an excellent question. Many of our listeners don't know, but my background actually, when I was trained as a pharmacist, is in infectious diseases. And one of the things we learned is that bacteria and viruses either develop resistance or mutate over time. And not every antibiotic works on every bacterial infection. Not every antiviral is going to work on every bacterial infection. So we do need choices in this environment, because even if a therapy has been authorized and it works currently on a viral infection or a bacterial infection, in this case, COVID being a viral infection, eventually they may stop working or may not work on, as you mentioned, a variant of the COVID infection, which is in this case, Omicron. So it is important for us to have multiple therapies, even within those classes, to make sure that patients have choice and physicians, pharmacists, nurses have choices to make that can then appropriately treat the patient.
What are some of the drawbacks or concerns about these treatments?
We've seen recently, right, from the Food and Drug Administration, where they withdrew the authorization for a couple of the antibodies that were made available in the marketplace. And the Food and Drug Administration looked at the data, and they concluded that none of the data coming from laboratory experiments showed that any of the antibodies that had received early use authorization had any activity against Omicron. And hence, what they decided is that, look, we're going to withdraw the authorization. And instead of revoking it, what they said is that in the future, as we know, we've seen with this virus, it mutates over time, over and over again, that in fact, if these antibodies do show activity for future mutations, that we will reinstate the authorization based on laboratory data or data that will come back to us. That was a very important thing. So with the antivirals, the oral antivirals, they have been tested against the Omicron variant, and both of them have shown activity so far in laboratory, and that's why the FDA has left the authorizations in place. But that's one of the biggest things, is that science evolves, as we've spoken in the past on this podcast, and it is important for us to evolve our treatment choices as science evolves, and not to think that you're going to basically stay in a static formation and not have to make changes potentially.
With all the flack that the FDA gets, I think that this is a good example of the process working. Something we thought worked didn't, so it was pulled until science shows otherwise. That's what we're going to act. But I am curious, where were these treatments developed? Were they developed specifically for COVID, or did we get these through other means, like what we've talked about with the mRNA vaccine?
That's a great question. Let me actually step back, Connor, and address the FDA comment that you made, which I thought it was brilliant, because I do agree with you 100%. Look, FDA, as a regulatory agency, a bureaucratic agency in the United States, gets a lot of flack, sometimes rightfully so. They're at times ambiguous, slow to act. But in this case, they should be applauded. They are following the science. What they said is that, look, these two antibodies that are been authorized are not showing any kind of an activity towards the current variants that is infecting about 99% of the infections are Omicron that are coming back. So what is the purpose of having these patients being treated with these antibody therapies? But let me address your second question, which is, are these new therapies that we're talking about, especially the oral ones, are they really new, or have we known about it? So the most promising therapeutic mechanism action to date appears to be the protease inhibitors that are being tested and researched. Protease inhibitors reduce the viral load by blocking the function of the essential viral protease enzyme required by the viruses to replicate. So they stop replication of these viruses. Protease inhibitors actually may trigger something in you, Connor, right? And remember, why have we used protease inhibitors in the past? And well, we have. They are very well studied and understood and are currently used effectively in treating HIV, hepatitis C infections. So we do have history of using protease inhibitors for antiviral infections. And now this platform, similar to mRNA, which was around, again, we talked about it in the last podcast, for decades, has been found to work for the COVID infection. And really, to answer your question, no, these are not brand new technologies. They're platforms that have been developed for other type of infections, but they're being utilized or re-engineered for treatment of COVID.
Looking back, and we all know hindsight's 2020, but what have we learned from the COVID vaccines that we can apply to the treatments to make it better, more accessible, et cetera, et cetera?
Connor, we have learned certain things, right? And I'm hoping that we will be able to replicate them, and we are replicating them in the treatment arena. In the US government was enabled the world's most effective shield against the worst COVID-19 by investing early and aggressively in multiple vaccines. As the pandemic becomes an endemic, similar efforts need to be sought out for therapeutic entrants in the marketplace, whether they're antibodies or antivirals, which will enable additional wins not only for the US population, but globally as well. And that's very important because remember, Connor, vaccines are terrific, without a doubt, and that should be the first choice. But they're also hard to manage and handle because they require refrigeration and hard to transport. But oral therapies, especially antivirals, can be transported very simply and provided to a global population. So it is important for the US government to step up and do the same things that they did for the vaccines, which is very aggressive regulatory work, which they've done, but also like investment both in the research part, but also in procurement, which they have done some, and also investing in manufacturing that should be done in the US. The US government needs to step up and do some of that stuff, and they're doing it, and they're doing it probably not to the extent that they did with the vaccines, but it should be done much more aggressively, both for the antivirals and the antibiotic therapies.
And especially when we think about this thing is going to get under control eventually, but it's not going to go away. We'll still be dealing with it like we deal with influenza. We're going to have to continually evolve these therapies and vaccines to make sure that we're on top of it and hopefully preventing something like a 4-year, 3-year-long pandemic from happening again.
You're absolutely correct. That's why we need treatments. We need vaccines to prevent, but we need treatments because the reality is, as we spoke earlier on the podcast, not everybody's going to get vaccinated for a variety of reasons. Personal choice, religious exemption, needle phobia, which is very common in adults especially, that people don't take into consideration. I believe, and I'm quoting Jim Cramer from CNBC, that these drugs, these therapies could be the atomic bomb that we once and for all get rid of this infection and go back to normalcy. And it's the game changer, in my opinion.
Well, as always, Robert, I want to make sure that you get the last word in here. Tell folks what they should take away from this episode.
Hope. Number one, we have vaccines that can help you prevent. Please get vaccinated first and foremost. If you cannot get vaccinated, know that there are treatments out there, whether they're antibody therapies or oral therapies, antiviral therapies, that will help you as a patient. Hope, because pharma companies, pharmaceutical industry, the biopharmaceutical industry, the government, the Food and Drug Administration are working tirelessly to bring these kind of therapies to you and make it accessible as possible. And finally, hope, because I believe with having vaccines, with having therapies that work, we will one day get rid of this epidemic and go back to our normal life. So 3 hopes, and I want to conclude that be patient. We will get through this. It's just going to take time, but everybody is working on it. We sincerely hope that you learned something too. We love to hear from you. Send your email or an audio clip to healthcarematters@ghlf.org.
Thanks for listening to Healthcare Matters, the podcast that pulls back the curtain to help you make sense of complex healthcare economics and policy issues. As always, we invite you to go to Apple Podcasts and leave one of those honest 5-star ratings and write a positive review. It's going to help people like you find people like us. And wherever you're listening, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. He's Dr. Robert Popovian.
And he's Connor Mertens. As always, please talk to your physician, pharmacist, your nurse. They have better answers than any of us will. But if you need more information, please reach out to Global Healthy Living Foundation and to talk to individuals like Connor who are waiting to be able to help you out. We'll see you all next time.
Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation Podcast Network.